The sun rose slowly over the marble rooftops of Rome, its pale golden light sliding across the columns of temples and the statues of forgotten gods. The city stirred with its usual rhythm, the distant clatter of carts, the murmurs of merchants opening their stalls, the calls of soldiers changing the night watch. To the people, it was another ordinary morning in the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, a man already sat awake, long before the city opened its eyes. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, did not rise with the sun. He rose before it. The chamber around him was quiet, lit only by the faint glow of an oil lamp. Scrolls were laid neatly on a small table beside his bed. The bed itself was simple, far plainer than what one would expect for the ruler of an empire that stretched from the misty forests of Germania to the burning sands of Egypt. Marcus had never cared much for luxury. Even now, as the most powerful man on earth, he preferred simplicity. It reminded him that he was not a god, not a king in the Eastern sense, but merely a man entrusted with a role. He dipped the stylus into ink and paused. His eyes, tired but steady, looked over the wax tablet in his hands. He wrote, slowly, carefully, as though each word had weight. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, arrogance, deceit, ill will, and selfishness. He stopped and read the words again. This was not a proclamation to the Senate, not a speech for the people, not a command to a general. It was a reminder to himself. The Emperor of Rome, the ruler of legions, began his day not with orders, but with philosophy. Believed something few men in his position ever understood. Power did not protect a man from suffering. It only changed the shape of it. A servant quietly entered the chamber, bowing his head. Caesar, the council awaits. Marcus nodded but did not immediately rise. Instead, he finished the sentence he had begun. They are like this because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and so none of them can harm me. He set the stylus down and closed the tablet. Only then did he stand. His robe was plain, his sandals worn. There were no jewels on his fingers, no gold on his shoulders. If a stranger saw him in the corridor, they might mistake him for a scholar or a teacher rather than the master of Rome. But the guard straightened as he passed. The servants bowed low. The air itself seemed to shift around him, as though the walls knew who walked between them. Marcus did not crave respect, but he carried it like a silent shadow. The council chamber was already filled when he entered. Senators in white togas stood in clusters, speaking in low voices. Generals in armor leaned over maps. Messengers waited with scrolls from the far corners of the empire. When Marcus stepped into the room, the voices died instantly. Caesar, one senator said, stepping forward, we have reports from the northern frontier. The tribes across the Danube grow restless again. Another added, there are also new cases of the plague in the eastern provinces. Marcus listened without interruption. His face did not change. To the others it must have seemed like an ordinary morning of imperial business. But to Marcus, every report was a reminder of how fragile everything truly was. An empire was not a stone monument. It was a living thing, breathing, shifting, vulnerable. It could grow sick. It could weaken. And one day, it could die. Send reinforcements to the Danube, he said calmly, not to provoke war, but to prevent it, and increase the medical provisions in the east. No city should be left to face the plague alone. The senators nodded, impressed by his steady hand. Marcus was known throughout the empire as a philosopher-king, a man of reason, not cruelty, a ruler of thought, not impulse. Under his leadership, Rome had known stability. Justice was enforced. Corruption was punished. The people slept peacefully, believing their emperor was both wise and kind. But even as they praised him, Marcus felt no pride. He knew too well how quickly fortune could turn. Later that day, he walked alone through the palace gardens. The fountains whispered softly. Olive trees cast gentle shadows on the paths. Birds hopped across the grass, unconcerned with the burdens of emperors. Marcus stopped near a statue of his adoptive father. Antoninus Pius, the old emperor, had ruled with patience and dignity, leaving the empire strong and stable. Marcus owed everything to him: the throng, the education, the example. "You left me a peaceful world," Marcus murmured softly. "I only hope I can keep it that way." But even as he spoke, a strange unease settled in his chest. He could not explain it. The empire seemed strong, the people respected him, the Senate supported him, his family was safe within the palace walls, and yet, the stoic part of his mind whispered a quiet warning. Nothing lasts, not power, not wealth, not even love. Marcus knew this better than most. He had lost children before. He had watched illness sweep through the city. He had seen how quickly crowds could turn from praise to anger. The world, he believed, was like a river, always moving, always changing, never still. And one day, that river would take everything from him. But not today. Today he was still emperor. The legions still marched under his banners. The people still cheered his name. Rome still stood, proud and unshaken. He turned away from the statue and walked back toward the palace. Messengers waited. Decisions needed to be made. The empire never rested, and neither could he. As he crossed the marble threshold, a young servant approached him. "Breathless Caesar, a rider has arrived from the north. He came without stopping. He says the news cannot wait." Marcus studied the boy's face. There was fear, their real fear. "Send him to the council chamber," Marcus said quietly. The servant nodded and ran off. Marcus stood alone for a moment. The corridor suddenly felt colder, the air heavier. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the faint stirrings of the storm that would soon arrive. He did not know it yet, but the day was coming when the Emperor of Rome would lose almost everything: his peace, his family, his certainty, and the illusion that even a philosopher-king could escape the cruelty of fate. And when that day came, the world would watch to see whether Marcus Aurelius was truly the man his writings claimed him to be, or just another ruler broken by loss. He straightened his robe and walked toward the council chamber, the sound of his sandals echoing softly through the marble halls. The sun had fully risen now, but for Marcus Aurelius, the long shadow of loss had already begun to stretch across his life. The rider arrived just before noon, his horse trembling beneath him, foam clinging to its mouth and flanks. The animal's ribs showed through its skin, and its hooves struck the palace stones with a dull, exhausted rhythm. The guards at the gates had nearly dragged the rider from the saddle. He could barely stand, his legs shaking from days of relentless travel. By the time he was brought before Marcus Aurelius in the council chamber, the man looked more ghost than soldier. "Speak," Marcus said calmly, though he could see the urgency in the rider's eyes. The man bowed awkwardly. "Caesar, the tribes beyond the Danube have crossed the river, entire villages burned, outposts overrun. Our men are retreating toward the fortresses." A murmur spread across the chamber. Senators leaned toward one another, whispering. Generals stepped forward, their faces hard with concern. "Which tribes?" one general asked Mark, and others. "Many more than we expected. They move like a storm." "Caesar, not small raids, an invasion." Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had hoped the tension at the frontier would remain just that, tension. But now the storm he had quietly feared was beginning to break. "When did this begin?" he asked. 2 weeks ago, but the messages were delayed. The roads are not safe anymore." The chamber fell silent. Marcus knew what that meant. If the roads were unsafe, then the borders were already weakening, and if the borders weakened, the empire's heart would soon feel the tremors. He stood slowly. "Prepare the legions. I will go north myself." The senators exchanged startled glances. "Caesar," one of them said cautiously, "there is no need for you to leave Rome. You can command from here. The generals will fight better knowing their emperor stands beside them." Marcus interrupted gently, "And the people will know I have not abandoned them." He spoke without anger, without force, but his words carried a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Within days, the palace was in motion. Messengers rode in all directions. Supplies were gathered. The clang of armor echoed through the courtyards. The once peaceful palace now hummed with the energy of war. But as preparations continued, another shadow crept across the empire, one far more silent and deadly than the tribes beyond the Danube. It began in the east, in the crowded streets of Antioch. Soldiers returning from campaigns against Parthia brought with them more than victory. They carried a sickness. At first, it was just a fever. Then came the coughing, the weakness, the strange black spots on the skin. Within weeks, entire households were dying. The plague moved like a whisper through the empire, from Antioch to Alexandria, from Alexandria to Athens, from Athens to Rome. And when it reached Rome, it did not knock politely at the gates. It crashed in like a tidal wave. Funeral pyres burned day and night. The smell of smoke and sickness hung in the air. Streets once filled with laughter and trade were now quiet, broken only by the rumble of carts carrying the dead. In the palace, servants began to fall ill, then soldiers, then officials. Marcus watched as the world around him grew thinner, quieter, more fragile. Each day, someone else was gone. One evening he walked through the palace corridors and noticed how empty they felt. The torches flickered softly, their light reflecting off the polished floors. He passed a doorway where, only days earlier, a young servant had stood, always eager to greet him with a smile. Now the doorway was empty. Marcus paused. He could not even remember the boy's name, and that realization struck him harder than the loss itself. He returned to his chamber and opened his tablet. What is not good for the hive, he wrote slowly, is not good for the bee. He stared at the words. The empire was the hive, and it was suffering. Soon after, another messenger arrived, this one pale, trembling, and unable to meet the emperor's eyes. Caesar, he said quietly, your daughter is ill. The words seemed to echo through the room. Marcus stood still. He had faced reports of invasion, plague, and unrest without a tremor. But this was different. Which one? He asked softly. The messenger swallowed. Little Vibia Caesar. Marcus felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. Not panic, not anger, just a heavy, familiar sadness. He had lost children before, too many, small lives, taken by fever, by sickness, by the cruel randomness of fate. Each loss had carved a silent scar into his heart. And now, fate had come again. He walked quickly through the palace, the marble floors cold beneath his sandals. When he reached the chamber, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and oil lamps. His wife, Faustina, sat beside the bed, her face pale with worry. The child lay beneath a thin blanket, her skin flushed with fever. Her small chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Marcus sat beside her and took her hand. It felt so small in his father. She whispered, barely audible. I am here, he said softly. For hours he sat there, no generals, no senators, no empire, just a father and his child. The Stoic teachings he had studied all his life whispered in his mind, accept what comes. Do not fear what you cannot control. Everything happens according to nature. But in that moment, philosophy felt very far away. As the night deepened, the girl's breathing grew weaker. The physician entered quietly, his face telling Marcus everything before he spoke. She will not see the morning, Caesar. Marcus closed his eyes. He did not cry. He did not shout. He simply nodded. When dawn came, the light crept slowly into the chamber, touching the walls, the bed, the still face of the child. Marcus sat beside her long after the others had left. The palace was silent again, as though the world itself held its breath. He looked down at her and whispered, you were only loaned to me, and now the world has taken you back. Later that day he returned to the council chamber. The generals waited. The senators stood ready with their scrolls. War at the frontier, plague in the cities, death in his own home. The cracks in the empire were widening, but Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, sat on his seat of power as though nothing had changed. His face was calm, his voice steady. Let us begin, he said, and the men around him obeyed, never realizing that behind the emperor's calm eyes, the foundations of his world were slowly starting to crumble. The day he would lose everything had not yet arrived, but it was drawing closer with every passing hour. Winter came early that year. Cold winds swept down from the northern forests, carrying with them the scent of snow and beyond smoke. The sky remained gray for days at a time, as though the sun itself had grown tired of watching the empire struggle. Along the Danube, the Roman camps were buried under layers of frost. Fires burned constantly, but the cold still found its way into armor, into bones, into the spirits of the men. Marcus Aurelius stood at the edge of the camp, his cloak wrapped tightly around him. Before him stretched the river wide, silent and frozen in places. On the other side lay the lands of the tribes, dark and endless, where war never truly slept. He had left Rome months earlier. The palace, the gardens, the marble halls, they all felt like distant memories now. Here, there was only mud, iron, and the sound of distant drums. A general approached him, his breath visible in the cold air. "Caesar, the scouts report movement beyond the trees. They may be preparing another assault." Marcus nodded. "Then we will be ready." The general hesitated. "The men are tired. Caesar, the cold, the sickness, it spread through the camp." Marcus knew. He had seen it in their eyes. The same plague that had ravaged Rome now followed the legions like a shadow. Soldiers coughed through the night. Some never woke in the morning. Every day, the burial pits grew deeper. "Remind them," Marcus said quietly, "that no man escapes death, but we can choose how we meet it." The general bowed, though his face showed little comfort in those words. When the man left, Marcus remained by the river. The frozen surface reflected the pale sky like a cracked mirror. He thought of Rome, of his wife, of the children he still had. He wondered how many of them he would see again. He reached into his cloak and pulled out his writing tablet. "Loss is nothing else," he wrote, "but change. And change is nature's delight." He paused. The words felt heavier than they had before. It was easy to write about loss in the comfort of the palace. It was harder here, where the wind howled through the tents and men died every night. Still, he continued writing, because writing was the only thing that kept him steady. Days later, the attack came. It began before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the soldiers were huddled around dying fires. A horn sounded from the watchtower. Then another. Then the screams began. The tribes surged from the forest like a flood. Torches lit the darkness. War cries echoed across the frozen ground. Arrows fell like rain. Marcus was pulled from his tent by the guards. "Caesar, you must move to the rear." But Marcus shook his head. "If the men bleed in the front, I will not hide in the back." He climbed onto a low rise where he could see the battle. Roman shields locked together, spears thrust forward. The sound of metal on metal filled the air. The tribes fought with wild fury, their faces painted, their voices roaring like thunder. For a moment, it seemed the Roman line might break. Then the legions pushed forward, step by step, driving the attackers back into the trees. The battle lasted hours. When it ended, the snow was stained dark with blood. Marcus walked among the wounded. He stopped beside a young soldier, barely more than a boy, clutching his side. "Caesar," the boy whispered, eyes wide with fear, "will I live?" Marcus knelt beside him. "No one truly lives forever," he said gently. "But you have done your duty, and that is enough." The boy tried to nod, but his head fell still. Marcus remained there for a long time, staring at the lifeless face. Another life gone, another name lost to time. The weight inside him grew heavier, but the true blow had not yet arrived. It came 3 days later, in the form of a single rider from Rome. The man's horse collapsed the moment it entered the camp. The rider stumbled forward, clutching a sealed scroll. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. Marcus knew, even before the scroll was placed in his hands, that it carried something terrible, that he broke the seal. The words were short, simple, cold. "Faustina is dead." The world seemed to go quiet. No battle cries, no wind, no sound at all. Marcus read the words again, as though they might change, but they did not. His wife, his companion for decades, the mother of his children, the woman who had shared the burdens of the throne, was gone. He did not remember sitting down, but suddenly he was on a wooden bench inside his tent. The scroll lay open in his hands, a lifetime together, reduced to a single sentence. He thought of her laughter in the palace gardens, the way she spoke to the children, the quiet conversations they shared late at night, when the world outside felt far away. All of it gone. He closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, Marcus felt something he had not allowed himself to feel, the urge to break. What was the point of philosophy now? What use were the teachings of Zeno, of Epictetus, of all the Stoics who spoke of acceptance and reason? Could reason bring back his wife? What could acceptance warm an empty bed? Could philosophy silence the loneliness that now crept into his chest? He wanted, just for a moment, to throw the tablet into the fire, to forget the lessons, to let grief take him like a storm. But he did not. Instead, he picked up the stylus with trembling fingers, and he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The words looked almost cruel on the tablet, but he forced himself to read them again, and again and again. Outside, the camp moved on. Soldiers sharpened swords. Fires were lit. Orders were given. The empire still needed its emperor. But inside the tent, Marcus Aurelius felt as though his world had collapsed. His daughter was gone. Now his wife was gone. The empire was at war. The plague still spread. Everything he loved was slipping through his fingers, one piece at a time. He set the tablet down and whispered into the silence, "Is this the test? Then, is this what it means to live as a philosopher?" No voice answered him, only the cold wind outside, rustling the tent walls like a distant, indifferent god. That night, Marcus did not sleep. He sat alone, watching the small flame of the oil lamp flicker in the darkness, and for the first time in his life, the emperor who ruled the world felt utterly, completely alone. The day he lost everything had finally begun. The days after the message arrived passed like shadows across a wall, slow, silent, and without meaning. Marcus Aurelius moved through them as though he were walking through a dream. The war continued, orders were given, reports were read, men saluted him as he passed. But inside, something had grown quiet, like a great hall emptied of all its voices. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of what was gone. In the camp, he saw soldiers sitting beside the fires, writing letters home to wives and children. Some laughed, some argued, some simply stared into the flames. Marcus envied them not for their rank or their comfort, but for the simple certainty that someone waited for them somewhere in the world. He no longer had that certainty. One evening, after the sun had sunk behind the black line of the forest, Marcus sat alone outside his tent. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed it. In his hands was the small writing tablet that had followed him from Rome to the battlefield. He turned it over slowly, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. For years, he had written in it everyday reminders, reflections, fragments of wisdom. It was not meant for others. It was not a speech, not a law, not a declaration. It was simply a conversation with himself. But now, as he stared at the blank surface, he found the words harder to reach. What could he write about loss that he had not already written before? He thought back to his youth, when he had first studied philosophy. He had been eager, curious, almost hungry for wisdom. The teachings of the Stoics had felt like a shield against the chaos of the world. Do not fear death. Do not cling to what you cannot keep. Accept what happens as part of nature. They had sounded so clear, so certain, almost simple. But philosophy is easiest when life is kind. It is much harder when grief sits beside you like an old companion. Marcus looked up at the sky. The stars were faint behind drifting clouds. Somewhere in the camp, a man coughed violently. Another voice cursed softly. The sounds of suffering were everywhere, and yet the world continued. The river still flowed. The wind still moved through the trees. The stars still turned. Above them, nature did not stop for emperors or widowers. He lowered his gaze and began to write. Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. Death hangs over you while you live, while it is in your power. Be good. He paused, studying the words. What did it mean to be good now? He could not bring back his wife. He could not undo the deaths of his children. He could not stop the plague from spreading through the empire like fire through dry grass. But he could still rule justly. He could still treat others with kindness. He could still endure. And perhaps that was all goodness truly was, not grand gestures or heroic victories, but quiet endurance in the face of suffering. The next morning, Marcus called the generals together. They expected orders about the war, plans, strategies, perhaps even a speech meant to stir their courage. Instead, Marcus spoke quietly. "Men," he said, "we are far from home. Many of you have lost friends, brothers, sons. I have lost my own family as well. We suffer together, as all men do." The generals exchanged uncertain glances. They had never heard an emperor speak so openly. "But suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to us," Marcus continued. "The worst thing is to forget what it means to be human, to grow cruel, to grow bitter, to become less than we were meant to be." He looked at each of them in turn. "The tribes across the river are our enemies, yes, but they are also men. They fight for their families, just as you do. Remember that. Fight bravely, but do not lose your souls in the process." No one spoke for a moment. The words were not what they expected, but somehow they felt heavier than any battle command. When the meeting ended, one of the older generals approached Marcus as Caesar. He said, "How do you remain so calm after everything you've lost?" Marcus thought for a moment. "I am not calm," he said. "Not always, but I remind myself that nothing I have lost was ever truly mine." The general frowned. "Your wife was not yours." Marcus shook his head gently. "She was a gift, a beautiful one, but a gift is not the same as a possession. One day, all gifts must be returned." The general had no answer to that. That night, Marcus returned to his tablet once more. "The universe is change," he wrote. "Our life is what our thoughts make it." He stared at the words. If life was shaped by thoughts, then grief itself could be shaped. Not erased, but understood, softened, carried differently. He closed his eyes and imagined Faustina as he last remembered her, not as a body in a tomb, but as a living presence, laughing in the gardens, speaking gently to the children, walking beside him through the palace corridors. The memory did not feel like a wound anymore. It felt like warmth. He opened his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for the time we had." The wind moved softly through the camp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant forest. For the first time since the message had arrived, Marcus felt something inside him shift. Not happiness, not peace, but acceptance that the loss was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer crushed him. It had become something he could carry, like a heavy cloak in the winter, but not unbearable. He picked up the stylus once more and wrote, "Accept whatever comes to you, woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs." He closed the tablet and set it aside. Outside, the soldiers prepared for another day of war. The empire still trembled under the weight of plague and conflict. The world had not grown kinder, but Marcus Aurelius had remembered who he was. Not just an emperor, not just a widower, not just a man surrounded by loss. He was a student of philosophy, a servant of duty, a human being like all the others. And as long as he still breathed, he would meet whatever came, not with rage, not with despair, but with the quiet strength of a stoic heart. The day he lost everything had changed him, but it had not broken him. Years passed, though they did not feel like years to Marcus Aurelius. Time, to him, had become something quieter, less dramatic, like a slow river moving through the same valley day after day. The wars continued along the northern frontier. The plague rose and fell like an invisible tide. Cities suffered, recovered, and suffered again. And through it all, Marcus remained where he had been since the storm began, among the soldiers. In the cold camps, far from the marble comfort of Rome, his beard had grown streaked with gray. The lines on his face had deepened. The man who once walked the gardens of the palace with the calm confidence of a philosopher-king now carried the look of someone who had seen too much of life's harshness to believe in illusions. Yet, those who served under him spoke of something strange. The emperor did not grow bitter. He did not grow cruel. He did not grow distant. If anything, he grew gentler. He listened more than he spoke. He punished less and forgave more. He treated even the lowest soldier with a quiet respect, as though each man carried within him a story worth hearing. One evening, after a long day of inspections, Marcus sat beside a small fire near the edge of the camp. A young officer approached him, hesitant. "Caesar," the man said, "may I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "You may ask anything," the officer swallowed. Do you ever regret becoming emperor? Marcus looked into the fire. The flames danced slowly, reflecting in his eyes. Regret, he repeated softly. No. But I do sometimes wonder what kind of man I might have been if I had lived a quieter life. A teacher, perhaps, or a simple student of philosophy. The officer smiled faintly. Rome would not have been the same without you. Marcus gave a small, tired smile. Rome would have survived. Empires always believe they depend on one man. But the truth is, no one is that important. He picked up a small stick and stirred the fire. Soon enough, another emperor will sit where I once sat, and one day, another after him. The world forgets us all in the end. The officer hesitated again. Does that thought not trouble you? Marcus shook his head. No, it comforts me. If everything is temporary, then our mistakes are temporary too. So are our failures, our losses, our pain. All of it passes. The officer nodded, though he was not sure he fully understood. When the man left, Marcus remained by the fire. He reached into his cloak and pulled out the small writing tablet. The edges were worn now, the surface scratched from years of use. It had traveled with him through war, plague, and grief. He opened it to a blank space and began to write. Soon you will have forgotten all things. Soon all things will have forgotten you. He paused, letting the words settle. There was no sadness in them, only truth. He thought of the people he had lost, his children, his wife, his friends. Their faces no longer brought sharp pain. Instead, they felt like distant stars, far away but still shining. Loss had not destroyed him. It had shaped him. It had stripped away his illusions, his comforts, his sense of permanence. It had shown him what remained when everything else was gone. And what remained was simple duty, character, kindness, reason. These were the only things a man could truly keep. One cold morning, as frost covered the camp like a thin sheet of glass, Marcus struggled to rise from his bed. His body felt heavy. His chest burned with each breath. The physician who examined him did not speak much, but his expression said enough. The emperor was dying. Marcus did not seem surprised. He had been expecting this moment for years. Death, to him, was not an enemy. It was simply the final change, the last transformation in a life full of them. He called for his son, Commodus. The young man entered the tent, dressed in fine clothing that seemed out of place among the rough surroundings of the camp. He looked at his father with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. Father, he said, the physicians say you must rest. Marcus smiled faintly. I have rested enough in my life. He motioned for Commodus to come closer. Remember this, Marcus said softly. You are not a god. You are not above the people. You are one of them. Rule with justice. Be patient. Be kind. Commodus nodded, though his eyes wandered, as though the words were already slipping past him. Marcus noticed, but he did not press further. Each man had to walk his own path. Even an emperor could not control the soul of his son. After Commodus left, Marcus asked to be alone. The tent was quiet. The cold air slipped through the seams of the fabric. Somewhere outside, a soldier laughed. Another coughed. Life went on. Even as death approached, Marcus lay back and closed his eyes. He thought of the palace gardens in Rome, the sound of fountains, the warmth of the sun on marble, the laughter of children, the gentle voice of Faustina. Then he let the images fade. They were beautiful memories, but they belonged to the past. And the past, like everything else, had to be released. He opened his eyes one last time and whispered, I have lived. I have done my duty. Now I return to the source. His breathing slowed. Outside, the sky was pale with the first light of dawn. The same light that had once touched the rooftops of Rome now fell softly over the cold military camp. And there, far from the throne room, far from the crowds, far from the marble statues and golden halls, Marcus Aurelius, emperor, philosopher, and man, took his final breath. The world did not stop. The river still flowed. The wind still moved through the trees. The empire still stood. But somewhere, in the quiet pages of a worn writing tablet, the thoughts of a grieving emperor remained what's written in the darkest days of his life, when he believed he had lost everything. And those words would outlive him. Long after the wars were forgotten, long after the palaces crumbled, long after his name became just another line in a history book, because Marcus Aurelius had discovered something rare in his suffering. He had learned how to lose everything and still remain himself.